species, they want other options basically. So the other option is looking at different types of introduced grass species. These are ones that evolved outside of North America and were introduced to the U.S. for their forage qualities. You know, as people immigrated to the U.S. and when they came, they brought the species of forages that they were most familiar with and planted those because they knew what they had and what type of qualities those particular species possessed. Now, some of the benefits, I guess, for the introduced species is they tend to establish very quickly. They can graze them within 1 to 2 years, and they also can respond very well to fertilizer and irrigation inputs. Their longevity, however, sometimes tends to be shorter than some of the natives. But again, the big plus for these is the seed cost tends to be relatively low. And to illustrate that, I just wanted today to give you just a brief overview of some of the different species out there, both the native and introduced, and some of the cost of those species on a per pound basis. On the left side of the diagram there, or the table, there's a list of different native species, and some of those we'll be talking about today, ranging in price anywhere from $3 per pound right now for western wheatgrass, a native species that we plant very commonly, up to $37.50 a pound for needle and thread grass. Again, another native species that's very common out here on the eastern plains. So, you know, if you're putting together a grass mix and maybe you want to plant 10 acres and say you want to include needle and thread in the mix, and even at £1 per acre, it's going to cost you $375 per acre just for that particular species. Now, comparatively, the introduced species range in price right now from about $1 a pound for tall fescue up to $2.35 a pound for meadow brome. Again, we'll be talking about a number of these introduced species today. So again, just a couple of definitions to get started. Bunch grasses, very common growth form for grasses. These grow in basically, just like as the name implies, big bunches or clumps. They're going to spread only by seed, and they tend to have a very large amount of leaf area that's grouped near the plant base. In the picture here is a picture of one of my favorite grasses, Great Basin wild rye. Grows native, again, as the name implies, throughout the Great Basin of the West here. This particular plant that you see in the picture was probably 4 to 5 feet in diameter. Again, that's one plant, one big old bunch. Now, plants like this, one drawback to them is they tend to be sensitive to defoliation or grazing at the wrong time. So you have to be careful with some of these bunchgrass species. The other caution thinking about planting bunch grasses is that some of those tend to be, they kind of start to pedestal themselves out in the pasture or the field, and it makes the field fairly rough. So if you're going to be haying that particular grass, you want to make sure that it's not one of those that will tend to kind of become this pedestaled and create a very rough type of field that's hard on equipment as you try to hay it. The other type of species of grasses that we deal with are what we call sod-forming grasses, and these are ones that have underground stems. Most of them will have rhizomes, a few of them will have stolons, but basically this is a means of vegetative spread that these species can undergo. They don't have to necessarily always start from a seed, so they can spread either by or be established by seed or by rhizomes. And when I put together a mix of grasses, I like to include at least one rhizomatous or sod-forming species in the mix because, again, they can spread by these underground stems, and especially in pasture situations, there's always areas, you know, close to the water tank or areas where the animals trail where the grasses get trampled out. So these species can quickly fill in some of those bare spots and, you know, reduce your soil erosion, keep your pasture productivity up, those types of things. And the other positive thing is that in pastures that are dominated by sod-forming grasses tend to be a lot smoother, a lot easier on your equipment out there. So this just illustrates visually, you know, the difference between the bunch grass and the sod-forming grasses. Orchard grass is on your left there. Both of these species were planted at the same time, and this represents 3-year-old stands. So the orchard grass is a bunch grass, and as you can see, you can still make out the drill rows. Again, it's not going to spread vegetatively, does not have those underground rhizomes. The bunches will get bigger over time as the plants mature, but that is the only way in which they kind of get at least a minor amount of spread. Compared to the creeping meadow foxtail on the right side there, after 3 years, it's basically formed a nice sod, basically kind of like a bluegrass lawn. Bluegrass would be another example of a sod-forming type species that most people are familiar with. So today we're going to talk about some, again, different types of species, different types of grasses. The first group that we're going to talk about is what we call the cool season grasses, and these will be ones that are suited to either irrigated conditions or sub-irrigated sites. Basically, these are going to require higher soil moisture for optimum productivity, stand bigger, those types of things. So basically, just as the name implies, cool season grasses grow best in the cool, moist spring months. That's when you can get the most productivity out of those types of species. Under dryland conditions, a lot of the cool season grasses will tend to go dormant during the hot part of the summer. But again, these species, if you provide them adequate moisture, they will tend to grow all summer long, which basically gives you a very long period of time in which you have, pasture or, multiple harvests of hay that you can get from these species. So the first species that we're going to talk about today is orchard grass. Worldwide, it is one of the most common, prevalent, irrigated or pasture-type grasses out there. It's a very dual-purpose type of a species. You can use it for pasture as well as hay production. One of its strong points is it recovers very quickly from defoliation. It's basically a continuous tillering type of a grass, which means that as it grows throughout the growing season, it's continually putting up new tillers. So if you harvest it, there's a new set of tillers down there ready to grow and to continue to produce forage for you. Again, this is a bunchgrass, and it's an introduced species. It's very leafy and palatable, very high in sugar content. Pretty much all livestock species will readily graze this one, as well as wildlife. This can be used to draw in things like deer and elk, again, because of its high palatability, high sugar content. And this is another strong point of orchard grass is that, again, if it's under irrigated conditions, and it will continue to grow and produce during that hot part of the summer, even though it is a cool season species. Now in Colorado, one of the drawbacks to orchard grass, and it doesn't happen every year, but in some years, and this winter might be one where we'll see some winter kill of orchard grass. When we have these dry, open winters with no snow cover, you'll often see some winter kill on the orchard grass. It likes, its roots to be moist over the winter time period, and these fluctuating temperatures that we've been under recently, it's just not a good thing for this particular species. Now, there are a number of different varieties of orchard grass out there, many different varieties. I've just named a few down here that might be possibilities for Colorado along the Front Range here. Eastern Plains. This Latar and Potomac are two good varieties that you might want to consider planting. There's a newer variety called Pizza. It's one that I've worked with. It tends to be more winter hardy, so it's not quite as susceptible to that winter kill. And then orchard grass, again, most of the varieties, you want to plant those in irrigated conditions, but there's also one variety out there called Paiute, and it tends to be more drought tolerant and will withstand dryland conditions down to about 12 to 14 inch precip zone. And it also works very well if you have, say, limited irrigation, maybe only have some irrigation water available in the spring. So there's just some photos of orchard grass. Again, very long, lax, leafy material, and leaves are where all of the forage quality is located. So any species that has this much leaf production, leaf matter, designates or generally indicates a very high quality type of a species. Again, the picture on the lower right just indicates the bunchgrass growth form. And the one thing about orchard grass, when you're trying to identify it, is it would tend to be a little bit lighter green in color than many of the other species of grasses that we deal with. So some of the identifying characteristics, again, it tends to be a little bit lighter green in color and often has kind of a bluish cast to it, so kind of that blue-green color. The leaves tend to be flattened and kind of folded, has this V shape to them. You can see in this photo on the lower right there, Again, kind of that V-shaped in the center of the leaf, and again at the mid vein of the leaf, I guess, the leaf kind of folds in on itself. Again, the leaf itself or the stem of the plant is actually flattened, so that's a very good way to identify it. Another thing I like to identify, or use to identify orchard grass, is that when you touch the plant or feel the leaves of the plant, it tends to be kind of slightly succulent, kind of a rubbery texture or feel to it. And I think that's a very good way to identify it. It's pretty characteristic of this particular plant. And the other thing is if you have the seed heads, if they're up and you can identify those, it's very characteristic. The seeds tend to be clustered on one side of the branch or the stem, and kind of forms this little cluster of seeds. Some people think it looks kind of like maybe a rabbit foot. That's how it's being referred to, I guess. So that's orchard grass. So now meadow brome is another species, bunchgrass type species, very similar to orchard grass. Works very well for irrigated pasture grazing situations as well as a hay grass. Again, one of its strong points is it recovers very quickly from defoliation. Again, a bunchgrass, but it can have short rhizomes, but it's not going to be a strong sod-former like the next species that I'll talk about. Again, very long, lax leaves, very palatable, high in sugars, high in quality. Animals just readily graze this particular species. Again, if it's irrigated, good midsummer growth. It doesn't tend to shut down during that hot period of time during that mid part of the summer. The advantage of meadow brome compared to the orchard grass, however, is that it tends to be more drought and winter hardy. So you don't have to worry about the stand losing the stand over the winter when we have these dry, open winters. Again, a number of different varieties out there. Regar is kind of the old standard variety that most of the seed companies will have. There's two varieties out of Canada called Fleet and Paddock. I planted those myself, and those are good varieties. The one that I'm really high on right now is it's a very new variety just within the last couple of years. It's coming out of Utah called Cash. And this one just very strong seedling vigor. You plant it, irrigate it, in about 4 to 7 days it's just up and jumps out of the ground. Very quick establishment, very strong seedling vigor, so it's one that's very easy to establish. Again, here's some photos of meadow brome. Again, just showing the very leafy nature. Again, although it can have short rhizomes, it tends to grow and look much like a bunchgrass. Most of you are probably familiar with smooth brome, and I'll talk about that one next. But the seed heads and everything of meadow brome look very similar if you're familiar with smooth brome. Some of the identifying characteristics, again, very long, lax leaves. The leaves can get up to 20, 24 inches long at times. They're going to be relatively narrow, and again, kind of have that light green color. One of the really distinguishing characteristics of meadow brome is in this photo here in the lower right. The leaves tend to be very hairy, especially along the edges of the leaves, and even at a distance you can tend to identify meadow brome because in the light, in the sunlight, those hairs tend to just kind of give this shimmer to it, and again, it's very easy to identify. Again, a seed head that's very similar to smooth brome, if you're familiar with that. However, the only difference is that the little florets tend to be on, I guess, on the meadow brome, whereas on the smooth brome, you don't have these little projections at the end of the seeds. So that's one way to identify it in the field when it's in flower in seed production. The next species is smooth brome. Again, smooth brome in the U.S. anyway, probably one of the most widely planted cool season grass species out there. It's a very adaptable species, very durable. You can use it for pasture and hay, and it's also been used extensively for reclamation type purposes. A lot of your roadside plantings, grassed waterways, those types of things will be planted into smooth brome. Now this one, unlike the other two species, this is a rhizomatous, and it's a strong sod-former. Okay, very strong, it has a lot of rhizomes, produces a very tight sod, helps to fill in those bare areas. And this one mixes very well with the orchard grass and the meadow brome. So again, I like to put just at least a little bit of smooth brome in the mix, again, so it can fill in those bare areas that, where the animals, around the water troughs, those types of things. And if you go to your local seed dealer and ask for an irrigated pasture mix, most seed dealers will have a kind of a pre-mix that they have put together. It will generally contain the orchard grass, meadow brome, and the smooth brome. Very drought tolerant. It responds very well to irrigation, but it is also very drought tolerant and will work under dryland conditions as well as irrigated. Very palatable, very nutritious. It's high in protein in the spring. Tends to be fairly low in fiber. Again, two qualities we like to see as far as in these different types of grasses. Very early spring growth, high spring yields, but kind of the drawback to this species compared to the first two I talked about is poor summer regrowth. It tends to pretty much kind of shut down during the middle part of the summer, even if it's irrigated. Another drawback is it tends to require high levels of nitrogen for maximum productivity. So it's another consideration. It will grow, but it's not going to be as productive without additions of nitrogen fertilizer. Again, there's different varieties out there. If you go to a local seed dealer, probably Lincoln is the one that is kind of the old standard variety that the seed dealers will have. There's also this Manchar variety. It's not as strongly rhizomatous, and it's one that we tend to plant at the higher elevations in some of the, like the high elevation mountain hay meadows. So here's, again, most of you are probably familiar. There's a lot of pastures, horse pastures, small acreage hay pastures, hay fields along the Front Range of Colorado, and smooth brome is going to be one of the dominant species in there. So probably most of you have seen and are able to recognize at least somewhat what smooth brome looks like. Probably one of the biggest identifying characteristics of smooth brome, it tends to have a relatively broad, flat leaf, up to a ½ inch wide, so it's one of the wider bladed grasses out there. But the other thing is on the leaf itself, it tends to have this little kind of constriction, and it's in the form of either a W or an M, depending on which direction you're looking at the leaf. But you can run your fingers down the leaf, and you can actually feel this little raised constriction in the leaf, and again, it's just a very easy identifying characteristic for this particular species. Again, this is a rhizomatous species. I have a picture of some rhizomes over here, and again, this allows it to spread vegetatively and fill in those bare areas. Next one is a tall fescue. Another very common cool season species, provides very high quality forage for grazing or hay, very durable in horse pastures, very good for stockpiled forage, makes for good high quality feed in the fall. It's probably one of our most productive cool season grasses. The big drawback is it tends to get coarse, and it's not as palatable as some of the other cool season grasses, so we tend not to mix this one with some of those ones I just talked about. The other thing to be aware of is certain varieties of this particular grass can have the endophyte, and it's just a fungus that lives within the plant, and it produces a toxin that can cause problems both with cattle as well as horses, and especially in horses you have to be careful with the pregnant mares, especially in that last 60 to 90 days of gestation. You can cause a whole array of different reproductive abnormalities. Again, a lot of different varieties out there. Fawn and Alta are just two possibilities, but there's one on the bottom there, this Max Q, which is a newer variety. And it has the endophyte in it, but the endophyte does not produce the toxin that causes the problems in either cattle or horses, so it's safe to feed to both cattle and horses. Again, this is a bunchgrass type species. Again, very productive, has kind of these open panicle type seed heads, kind of a flowing type of a look to it. Easy identifying characteristic for this one is the leaves tend to have these, they tend to be stiff and dark green and have these deep grooves on the upper surface, and the underside tends to have kind of a shiny appearance to it. Again, produces a very big bunch of very stiff leaves. Again, some of these aren't as palatable as some of the other species I talked about. So those are the species that work for irrigated conditions. There's also some cool season grasses that work very well under limited irrigation or dryland type situations. The first one is crested wheatgrass. Again, probably one of the most drought tolerant grasses that we have out there. 10 to 12 inch precip zone, even lower than that in certain situations. This is a bunchgrass. Primarily, there are a few varieties that tend to have rhizomes. Provides very early spring grazing. It's probably a better grazing species than a hay species. But once you graze it or hay it off in the spring, it tends to not regrow. It pretty much kind of goes dormant during that hot part of the summer. I really like the high crest variety. It tends to be, it's a leafy variety and comes on early in the spring. Pretty good forage producer. Many of you have probably seen crested wheatgrass. It's identified probably best by its distinctive seed head. There's hardly any other grass out there that has that type of a seed head. Kind of the seeds kind of grow outward from the two sides of the stem, and it kind of produces a kind of a fan-shaped seed head, I guess I would describe it as. Two other ones that are related to one another. They're intermediate and pubescent wheatgrass. They're very similar in growth form, do pretty well, just a little more moisture than the crested wheatgrass. These have rhizomes, so they can form at least mild sods. Palatability doesn't tend to be quite as good on these species as some of the other cool season grasses. The pubescent form of this one tends to be very competitive against weeds. And so if you're trying to get rid of some weeds like leafy spurge, thistle, and some of those, this one will compete very well against that. Here's some photos of the intermediate and pubescent wheatgrass. Again, tends to be a little more of a stemmy type of a species. Again, not quite as palatable as some of the other species that I talked about earlier. Most of a lot of the wheatgrass type species tend to have this kind of this bluish color, glaucous. It's kind of a waxy type material that forms on the leaves and the stems. Gives it that blue-green color. The seed head is typical of many wheatgrasses. Has these florets that form on alternating sides of the stem. It's just very diagnostic of wheatgrasses. And you also, one of the other diagnostic characteristics is most of the wheatgrasses will have what we call auricles, and they're just little short extensions of the leaf that kind of clasp around the stem where the leaf blade joins the stem. So that's another diagnostic characteristic to look for. Western wheatgrass, all the species we've talked about so far have been introduced species. Western wheatgrass is a native species. It's a rhizomatous species, so it's a good sod-former. Kind of has moderate palatability. Livestock, especially the older it gets, it becomes coarse with age, and so the animals don't like it quite as well as it gets a little more mature. Again, I like to mix this one. If I'm putting together a native mix, I like to mix this with some of the bunch grasses, again, to fill in some of those bare spots. Again, there's been a number of different varieties of wheatgrasses on the market. You know, Ariba, Barton, Rosanna, just to name a few. Again, like many wheatgrasses, and especially western, tends to have that bluish, glaucous color to it. Again, forms kind of a sod from those rhizomes. Very characteristic as how you would see it when you're out in the field, out in the pasture looking at it. Again, the leaf blades, again, one of the things I would look for identifying characteristics. Tends to have kind of those deep veins on the leaf, as well as the auricles. And if you run your fingers down the leaf, it kind of has a sandpapery feel, especially along the edges, kind of these little serrated edges. And the leaves tend to be very stiff and erect and kind of taper to a fine point out there. Two more I'd like to just close up with here, and these are warm season species. Again, everything we've been talking about so far have been cool season species. The warm season grasses they're adapted to the hotter part of the summer, those hot summer temperatures. That's when they're going to be most productive. And because of that, they don't tend to like the higher elevations. So once you get above about 6,000 feet, many of these species do not grow very well. So they work very well down here on the Front Range and Eastern Plains. The first one is blue grama. This is the state grass of Colorado. It's one of the co-dominant species out there on the shortgrass prairie out on the Eastern Plains. Grows well with some of the other species like needle and thread, green needlegrass, and the western wheatgrass that I just talked about. It tends to grow kind of as a bunchgrass in the more warmer southern part states, but as a sod-former in the more northern states, as well as in the higher elevation mountain areas. basically the bunches just kind of grow together over time, so it doesn't really have the rhizomes. Very palatable, nutritious feed. It's not as productive as some of the other ones that I talked about, again, because it's very drought tolerant and grows in that warmer part of the growing season. Again, very grazing tolerant. You take care of this at all, it's very difficult to graze this species out. Again, there's a number of different varieties out there. This Alma is a pretty good one for Colorado. There's a new one called this Bad River Ecotop type that comes out of South Dakota that I planted at some of the higher elevations in the South Park area, and it's done very well up there. So hopefully most of you have seen blue grama, but probably one of the identifying characteristics is its seed head. Kind of this long row, kind of a double row of seeds that form on one side of the stem. And then as that stem, or as those seeds dry and mature, it tends to curl, kind of into the shape of an eyebrow, some people describe it as. So that's a very distinctive characteristic of blue grama. Probably one of the best ways to identify it. And the last species I'll talk about is Buffalograss. Again, it's codominant out there on the shortgrass prairie with blue grama. This is one of the few grasses that reproduces vegetatively by stolons, which is basically just a stem that runs on the top of the ground. So if anybody is familiar with the stolons on strawberries, very similar on Buffalograss. It's also one of the few grasses that has both male and female plants. Again, very highly palatable, nutritious forage for livestock. Again, very drought tolerant. It's not going to be as productive as the blue grama. Again, it's going to have a paler leaf, finer leaf than the blue grama. It can grow very long though, and again, very palatable. Has a seed head, again, it has male and female, so this is the male flower part. Again, it looks similar to the blue grama. Again, it grows on one side of the stem, but it's a lot shorter in length compared to the blue grama. If we look down in the lower right here, we have the female plants, and they form these little kind of inflated bulb-like structures, and a lot of people use Buffalograss for a lawn-type grass as well, but you don't really want to have the female plants because you don't want to be walking out there on that those little stiff bulblets. It really not very good to not a good feel on the bottom of your feet, I guess. So, and I think with that, that's the end of my presentation, and I think we're going to take questions.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Joe. That was great. So we can take a few questions now, and also Joy's going to pop up some evaluation questions. These are just questions that help us for future webinar planning. So the first one, how did you learn about this webinar? The second one, how helpful was the information presented? Thirdly, do you plan to use some of the practices, skills, or information that Joe presented? And then finally, how would you rate the length of this webinar? So while you're answering those, we can go ahead and start taking some of your questions. So do you want to scroll up to the top of the chat box there? Let's see. Okay, yeah, that's good. Thanks, Joy. All right, so Katie Miller says, are there any free publications about Colorado native grasses available?
I'm not sure.
I know that Pawnee Butte Seeds has a great little booklet, and I use that a lot when I'm out in the field. Otherwise, you can, they're not free, but you could probably pick up a field guide. Do you have any favorite field guides for grasses, Joe?
Grasses are tough, so
They are.
There's no real easy way to identify grasses. That Pawnee Butte one is a good one, and it is actually online through their website, so that's a good place to go to look for information. So nothing comes to mind, I guess, as far as what's available out there. So.
Pawnee Buttes is a seed dealer in Greeley, so yeah, check that out, Katie. Tony Knight, which of the following species you mentioned will crowd out cheatgrass? Ooh, good question.
Cheatgrass. Crested wheatgrass is used a lot for cheatgrass control in the Great Basin region, so that's a really good one. The pubescent wheatgrass is probably another one that would be very good at crowding out cheatgrass. Those two would be probably, the ones I talked about would be good for doing that.
Okay. Pat says, can we get copies of the PowerPoint? Yes, I was going to mention that this presentation is recorded, and I'll send you all links to this webinar as well as all the other past webinars that I've done, and they're all available on the Small Acreage website. So does anyone else have any questions before we finish up? I guess while you're thinking about questions, I just wanted to point out that our next series of webinars are going to be on livestock, and so we're going to kick off the webinar series with a presentation by Dr. Temple Grandin, who's probably the most famous autistic person maybe even in the world. So she'll be talking with us about animal behavior, so that will be one not to miss, and that will be on March 28th. And then the next one we have lined up is on small-scale cattle production, so that will be with Dr. Jason Ahola from here on campus, and that will be May 18th. And then we also have a bunch more livestock webinars still in the planning phases. So if you want to sign up for those, you can email me, Jennifer Cook at colorado-state.edu. And let's see, do we have another question? Jay says, are natives harder to plant and establish than introduced species?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, definitely they're slower to establish. I mean, you still need the same types of equipment. I mean, drilling is always better as far as whether you're establishing natives or introduced type species. I guess the big thing is to be patient. It just takes longer for them to get a well-established root system and attain, I guess, full productivity. Again, sometimes 2 up to even 4 years on some of these particular species. So you don't want to be putting animals out there before the plants are actually ready to be grazed.
Okay. Oh, good. So Joy put up my email address. Thank you. Carol says, how does one determine how much grazing a grass will take? That's kind of a tough one to answer. I'll put you on the spot for that one.
Well, the old rule of thumb is again, once the plants are well established, and then we kind of take the old take half, leave half principle. You take about half of what's available and leave the other half. One of the big things when we're managing any type of grass is the management of leaf area. You don't want to, the grass gets most of its carbohydrates through photosynthesis. So if you remove all the leaf area or remove the leaf area down to a short stubble height, the plant can't, process or make as much carbohydrates, sugars, and so it tends to decrease in vigor over time. So it's really, manage that leaf area, that stubble height that you leave out there. And for most grasses, it's going to be around 4 inches. Don't graze any lower than about 4 inches.
And Carol, as part of our next livestock webinar series, I'm going to do a presentation on grazing and pasture management. So that'll probably give you a lot more information on how to manage your grasses with grazing pressure. Pat Galvin, when planting these grasses, is it a good idea to add fertilizer?
Typically, when you're putting in a new field of grass, it's not a good idea to put down fertilizer, especially nitrogen fertilizer. If you want to do a soil test and see if the soil is low in phosphorus, because phosphorus really stimulates root production, root growth. So if the soil is low in P, you want to add some phosphorus at the time of planting, but really minimize any additions of nitrogen fertilizer, because you're always going to have weeds, and the weeds will outcompete the grasses, especially if it's a high nitrogen fertility situation. So phosphorus, yes; nitrogen, no. And then Tony's got a...
Tony, does max Q tall fescue grow well in Colorado, especially for horse pastures?
Tony, I've planted a little bit of it, and it seems to do well here. They're working on other varieties that have the novel friendly endophyte in them as well, but I wouldn't have any. I would at least give it a try. I think it's a good one to give a try anyway. I think it will do well here in Colorado for the most part.
So I kind of have a question off of Pat's fertilizer question. So you want to give phosphorus at the beginning during establishment, and then throughout the grass's life, do you need to fertilize or not? Or does it depend on whether it's native or not?
Yeah, the native species we typically don't fertilize unless you're maybe put the natives under irrigation or something. You're trying to push the productivity a little bit. But for the introduced species that I talked about, yes, if you want them to be productive, you're going to have to add nitrogen fertilizer as well as watch your phosphorus levels to obtain, get the most productivity out of them that you can. So
It's probably a good idea to do soil testing to figure out just how much NNP you need.
Yeah, most of the soils are going to be low in nitrogen. That's almost a given here, especially here in Colorado. The one you really need to look at in your soil test is the phosphorus, and then also pH and some of those other factors are important. But phosphorus is the key one to look at in a soil test.
Okay. All right, we have a few more questions. Carol, what do you like for phosphorus?
As far as a source of phosphorus, there's what they call triple superphosphate, and that's about the only one that's available as a true, it doesn't have any other nutrients in it, but it is typically hard to find. So most of the time we end up with going with something that has just a little bit of nitrogen in it. Something like monoammonium phosphate has 11% nitrogen and 52% phosphorus in it, or the diammonium phosphate, which has 18% nitrogen and 46% phosphorus in it. Those tend to be cheaper, and you get a little bit of nitrogen. That little bit of nitrogen typically is not going to hurt anything. It's only going to be maybe 10 to 15 pounds per acre of actual nitrogen that you're putting on with that phosphorus.
All right, so Mark's question, what varieties of western wheat would you recommend for high altitude situations above 8,000 feet?
You can answer that, Mark. I've typically used, I think Rosanna is the one I've normally used at the higher elevations. I think Ariba, it's more of a lower elevation variety. Yeah, I think the Rosanna would be the one I would probably recommend.
Okay, it looks like someone else is typing, so we'll hang on. If people need to log off, that's fine. We'll stay on for a few more minutes with questions. Need some music. Okay, there we go. Jerry's got his question. What would you recommend for sandy soils?
Sandy soils. That's a tough one. There are some varieties or some species out there that are better adapted to sandy soils. A lot of those tend to be some of the warm season type species. Not sure exactly where you're at, but Strasburg area. Probably things like sand bluestem, prairie sandreed would be a couple of native species that do well in sandy soils, dryland conditions. I mean, things like blue grama it does better probably on the heavier soils, but it will do fairly well under. Depends on how sandy the soil is. I don't deal with the sandy soils enough, I guess, to know off the top of my head what would be the best.
Yeah, I think usually the natives are better.
The natives would typically be better, yeah.
And then Megan, how about soils with high salt content, which is pretty common too in Colorado?
Yeah. Well, the most salt-tolerant species out there, one I didn't talk about, is tall wheatgrass. It will withstand the highest level of salt in the soil. It's not the most palatable species. Tends to get kind of stemmy. You have to be careful when you're grazing it. It tends to raise its growing point early, so it's kind of a hard species to graze. It works really well for fall pasture, winter stockpile type forage. Probably the one that I would recommend would be, it's called hybrid wheatgrass, and New High is the variety. It is a cross between a native wheatgrass called blue bunch wheatgrass and quackgrass. Quackgrass is kind of considered to be a weedy type species, especially in farm ground, but has rhizomes, and so it can be very aggressive. But by doing this cross between a bunchgrass and a rhizomatous species, they kind of combine the qualities, the good qualities of both. Blue bunch has good palatability, leafy growth. The quackgrass has the durability, and so, but you get really good salt tolerance as well with that New High hybrid wheatgrass. So that would be one I would recommend under high salt conditions.
All right. We had some great discussion and questions, so thanks so much, Joe, for joining us with all your expertise. I guess if anyone has any follow-up questions, you can email them to me, and if I can't answer them, I can get Joe to help me out. Otherwise, thanks for joining us today, and I hope to see you for our next webinar on March 28th on handling cattle and other livestock. Thanks so much.